Albus Dumbledore, The Phoenix Ascendant, a non-profit Harry Potter fan fiction. Book 1, The Ember of Genius. Chapter 1, Patterns in the Frost. Godric's Hollow was the sort of village that believed in order. The chimneys smoked politely into winter air. The hedgerows were trimmed with quiet discipline. Even the church bell seemed to strike with careful dignity, as though reluctant to disturb conversations already underway among the wind and stone. The Dumbledore house stood slightly crooked where the lane curved, its windows often glowing faintly even when no lamp burned inside. The villagers had long since decided not to speak about it too directly. On a brittle December evening, 10-year-old Albus Dumbledore sat in the narrow window alcove of his bedroom, knees drawn toward his chest in the manner of someone who preferred observation to movement. Frost had begun tracing itself across the glass earlier that afternoon. Most children might have drawn shapes in it, or wiped it away. Albus studied it instead. The crystalline branches spread outward in mathematical certainty, each line splitting into smaller lines at measured intervals. He tilted his head slightly. "Not symmetrical," he murmured. The breath of his voice clouded the window momentarily. The frost paused. Then, very quietly, the branching angles shifted. Not violently, not as though forced, but as though correcting a minor structural. On his desk lay a heavy leather-bound volume he had borrowed, without explicit permission, from a traveling wizard who had visited the village the previous month. The book concerned elemental convergence theory, though much of it was written in language so archaic that even Albus found himself rereading sentences twice. Magic, he suspected, was not something to be commanded like livestock. It was more like music. Most wizards struck at it with spells and gestures, imposing rhythm where they believed rhythm should be. But rhythm already existed. Understanding it was the challenge. The candle beside him stretched its flame unusually thin. Albus froze. The sensation returned, that faint disturbance he had first noticed days earlier. Not movement, not sound, something subtler, as though the world had been drawn too tightly around a hidden structure. He closed his eyes. Beyond the village boundary, magic was being altered rather than cast. The pull was deliberate, patient, and somewhere within that stillness, he felt the faintest impression of awareness, like a question waiting to be asked in a language he was only beginning to learn. The candle flame flickered once, silently elongating toward the ceiling as if reaching for something unseen beyond the roof beams. Albus did not move, because for the first time, he was certain that whatever was watching had just noticed that he was listening back. Chapter 2, The Hollow Between Seconds. The hill beyond Godric's Hollow was not considered important by most villagers, though children sometimes claimed the wind behaved differently there. Albus believed the children were correct. The following afternoon, beneath a sky the color of unpolished steel, he climbed the slope alone. Frost clung stubbornly to the grass, and the ancient oak at the summit stood skeletal against the winter horizon. The air felt thinner the closer he approached. Not cold, thin, as though sound itself hesitated before crossing the tree's shadow. Albus placed his gloved palm against the bark. The world faltered. A leaf suspended halfway through its fall froze completely, trembling slightly, as if uncertain whether gravity still had authority over it. The distant river ceased its murmuring. Even the wind seemed reluctant to move. Time had not stopped. It had stretched. Between one heartbeat and the next, Albus perceived it. A shimmer in the air before him, no wider than a coin, glowing faintly blue. It was not light. It was absence given shape, a tear imperfectly stitched into the fabric of existence. Albus leaned closer, breath steady and controlled. Within the fracture something stirred. Not a body, not a face, not even a consciousness in the human sense, but awareness. It brushed against his thoughts cautiously, like a hand. With deliberate precision, Albus traced a stabilizing rune in the air. The symbol had been copied from an obscure manuscript whose author he suspected had not fully understood its implications. Golden light shimmered faintly at his fingertip. The blue tear wavered. For a moment, something immense pressed against his awareness. Not hostile, but ancient beyond comprehension, like pressure from the depths of an ocean no human had mapped. Then the fracture contracted sharply. Time returned violently. The leaf struck the ground. The wind burst through the oak branches with renewed noise. The world resumed its ordinary breathing as though it had been startled awake. Albus staggered backward but remained standing. His heart was beating faster than usual, though he was unsure whether it was excitement or something more complicated. It had not expected to be seen, and now it knew he could see it. As he turned slowly toward the distant horizon where Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry would soon wait for him, Albus felt the faintest sensation settle somewhere beneath his certainty. Whatever lived inside that fracture was patient. And patience, he suspected, was a form of intelligence older than fear. Far away, somewhere beyond mountains and thought itself, something shifted quietly in the darkness, as though recognizing that the boy on the hill had just learned to look back. Chapter 3. The Theory of Unspoken Magic. Albus discovered very early that magic behaved differently when it was observed rather than commanded. That observation became the foundation of what he privately called unspoken magic, though he knew the term would likely irritate any formal academic who later encountered it. The Dumbledore house was quiet that evening. Aberforth had taken Ariana outside for a walk along the lower lane, leaving Albus alone with the ticking of an old wooden clock and the faint scent of burning peat from the hearth. He sat cross-legged on the floor of the small study, a candle positioned before him. Most young witches and wizards practice spellcasting by repeating incantations and learning precise wand movements. Albus found the process unnecessarily noisy. He suspected magic did not require noise. He raised his right hand, palm facing the candle flame. He did not speak. Instead, he focused on structure. If magic was language, then intention was grammar and awareness was meaning. The physical gesture of a wand was merely a translator between thought and external effect. He slowed his breathing deliberately, counting each inhalation until his awareness settled into stillness. The flame flickered once. Albus did not attempt to force it upward or sideways. He imagined instead the relationship between heat, air displacement, and the invisible structure of magical response. Sweat gathered faintly at his temples, though he felt no physical strain. Then he released the focus. The flame returned to its normal height, as though nothing had occurred. Albus lowered his hand slowly. The experiment had succeeded. Wandless magic was not about force projection. It was about reducing the distance between thought and environmental response. The fewer interpretive layers between intention and manifestation, the more efficient the result. He suspected most wizards would consider such a method dangerous, because it removed familiar safeguards. A sudden shiver passed through the air. The candle flame wavered despite the absence of wind. The sensation was subtle but unmistakable, the same presence he had sensed near the hill, though distant now. Watching, not intruding, merely acknowledging. Albus did not attempt to reach toward it. He had learned that pursuit often disrupted clarity. Instead, he placed his hand flat against the wooden floor and considered the architecture of magic itself. Somewhere beyond comprehension, the fracture he had seen was waiting patiently. And Albus Dumbledore had begun to suspect that it was not simply broken reality. It was something learning to observe him in return. Outside, the wind moved quietly through the winter trees as though carrying a question it had not yet decided how to speak. Chapter 4. Books that were not meant to be read. The library of Godric's Hollow was small, dimly lit, and possessed a smell that was somewhere between aging paper and forgotten sunlight. Albus visited it whenever he could escape the house. Most of the books available to children his age concerned local history, basic natural philosophy, or moral instruction written in language so careful it bordered on timid. Albus read them anyway, not because he expected intellectual revelation, but because even simple knowledge contained patterns worth studying. What truly interested him were the books kept behind the librarian's private desk. They were not explicitly forbidden, but they were never offered. Albus had noticed that adults often created the illusion of restriction by avoiding direct prohibition. So he waited until the librarian grew distracted by a conversation about weather and borrowed a key from the collection drawer using a quiet manipulation of airflow and timing that would have been difficult to detect unless one were specifically searching for it. The lock clicked open with polite reluctance. He entered the private storage room. The shelves here were older. The parchment was thicker. Many of the volumes were bound in materials he could not immediately identify. He selected a book titled Pre-Structural Manifestations of Arcane Field Theory. The author was long dead. The opening chapter described magic not as action, but as environmental probability. A third manuscript explored something the author called silent magic, a theory suggesting that advanced practitioners might reduce spell casting to near-thought state by eliminating intermediary gestural translation. Albus traced a diagram with his fingertip. The theory proposed that magic responded most efficiently when the mind's intention was stabilized into singular conceptual focus rather than distributed emotional impulse. He considered this carefully. Emotion, he suspected, was not inherently chaotic to magic, but unstable emotion might introduce variance into structural alignment. The librarian's footsteps approached outside. Albus closed the books quietly and returned them to their precise original positions. The key slipped back into the drawer without sound. He left the storage room, thanking the librarian politely on his way out. The winter air outside felt sharper. As he walked home through the village streets, Albus felt the familiar distant sensation again, the patient awareness he had sensed on the hill and during his experiments. It was closer than before, not threatening, not rushing, simply waiting, as though studying the boy who studied it. And somewhere in the quiet architecture of existence, something very old adjusted its observation of him by a fraction of a degree. Chapter 5. The Boy Who Calculated Magic. The letter from Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry arrived in a curl of emerald flame that descended politely into the Dumbledore kitchen as though it had been trained in good manners. Aberforth reacted by dropping a spoon. Albus accepted the envelope without surprise. The seal was impressed in deep scarlet wax bearing the school crest, which he examined briefly before breaking it open with careful fingers. The parchment inside was heavy, authoritative, and written in precise formal script that carried the quiet confidence of established institutions. He read it once, then again. The acceptance itself was not unexpected. What interested him more was the tone, expectant rather than congratulatory, as though the school believed he would naturally continue along a predetermined academic trajectory. Aberforth was staring at him. "You're not going to jump around shouting, are you?" Expression of excitement is not a necessary response to validation, Albus said calmly. Aberforth frowned. "You're going to be insufferable there." "Almost certainly." Preparations for departure began slowly. Albus packed books more carefully than clothing. He wrapped several advanced theoretical manuscripts in protective cloth, including notes he had taken regarding unspoken magic experiments. While folding his robes, he felt it. Observation. The sensation was different from, "I hear you read advanced theory." "I do." Elias nodded as though confirming a hypothesis. "I prefer practical application," Elias said. "Theory is useful only when it increases operational efficiency." Albus considered this. "Theory is not opposed to application," he replied. "It defines the boundaries within which application is reliable." Elias smiled slightly. "I believe magic should be optimized," the other boy said. "Most wizards waste energy through unnecessary emotional resonance and inefficient spell structuring. That assumes magic is purely mechanical," Albus said. "Is it not?" Albus did not answer immediately. The wind moved through the square, carrying dust from the fountain stone. After a moment he said, "If magic were purely mechanical, then discovery would be unnecessary." Elias tilted his head. "You believe magic can be improved. I believe understanding can be improved." There was a pause. Then Elias spoke quietly. "I intend to be the best student Hogwarts has ever produced." Albus felt the faintest trace of curiosity rather than rivalry. "That is a measurable objective," Albus said. "And you?" Albus looked toward the distant horizon where winter clouds gathered over the hills. "I intend," he said thoughtfully, "to understand magic better than anyone who has ever tried to study it." Elias studied him for several seconds. Then, Chapter 6, the first lesson. The morning sunlight fell in long pale bars across the stone floors of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through the air as though time itself preferred to move slowly inside the castle corridors. First-year students gathered inside the Transfiguration classroom with a mixture of excitement and suppressed nervousness. The room smelled faintly of old parchment, warm wood, and the faint metallic scent that accompanied active magical wards. Professor Dippet stood at the front, hands folded behind his back. Transfiguration, he announced, is the discipline of structural magical transformation. Remember that today. The statement was delivered as if it were both instruction and warning. Albus sat beside Elias Thorne. Elias was already studying the wooden match placed in front of them, as though analyzing an opponent before a duel. "Turn it into a needle," the professor said. Several students began whispering the incantation under their breath while attempting the wand motion demonstrated earlier. Elias moved first. His wand gesture was precise and economical, almost surgical in appearance. He spoke the spell softly, with confidence rather than emphasis. The match shuddered. Its wood fibers tightened, realigning structure as brown surface contracted inward. Within seconds it lengthened and sharpened into a metallic needle, polished and symmetrical. Elias placed the needle on the table without ceremony. A few students stared. Elias turned slightly toward Albus, but said nothing. Albus did not reach for his wand immediately. Instead, he examined the match. He imagined the molecular arrangement of cellulose fibers. Not destruction, transformation, compression of structural variants into a new configuration. He lifted his hand. No incantation, no spoken word. He focused on the relationship. Slowly, almost delicately, the wooden structure compacted inward. The color darkened as internal bonding reorganized. The form elongated under controlled energetic influence until it hardened into a needle nearly identical to Elias's. The difference lay in finish. Albus's needle possessed a microscopic spiral pattern along its surface, an unintended result of his stabilization focus. He placed it beside Elias's. The classroom was silent for a moment longer than necessary. Professor Dippet approached, studying both objects. "Interesting," the professor said eventually. Elias spoke first. He achieved the transformation without verbal casting. Albus added quietly. The efficiency was marginally higher, but structural stability was slightly reduced during the final phase. Elias's eyebrows lifted a fraction. "You analyzed your own result?" "Yes." The professor smiled faintly in a way that suggested both approval and concern. "Mr. Dumbledore," he said, "you should be aware that most first-year students do not perform comparative optimization analysis during their first lesson." Albus nodded. "I am aware." Across the table, Elias spoke softly. "You prioritize understanding over demonstration." "Yes." Elias considered this. "I prioritize improvement over tradition." The two boys looked at each other for a long moment. Not hostile, not friendly, but measuring. Outside the classroom window, a gust of wind moved unexpectedly across the castle towers. Deep within the ancient stone foundations of Hogwarts, something stirred faintly, as though acknowledging that two young minds had just begun competing to define the future shape of magic. Chapter 7. The Shelves That Should Not Be Touched. The restricted section of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry Library was not guarded by loud alarms or dramatic enchantments. Instead, it was guarded by silence. Students spoke about it in whispers. Older pupils warned that the books inside were unsettled, a description that meant different things depending on who was speaking. Albus had spent several evenings observing the entrance. The librarian's chair was positioned slightly askew from the main walkway, allowing her peripheral vision to monitor anyone approaching the forbidden shelves. The wards protecting the section were layered rather than singular. A simple unlocking charm would fail because the magic here responded primarily to intent recognition, which meant deception was more effective than force. On a night when the castle corridors were quiet and most first years were already asleep in their dormitories, Albus walked toward the library carrying a borrowed book he had finished reading earlier that afternoon. He paused at the main desk. The librarian was speaking softly with another professor about the winter ward maintenance schedule. Albus allowed a very gentle shift in airflow around the desk lamp. The light flickered once. Both adults turned instinctively toward the disturbance. At that exact moment, Albus placed the returned books silently into the outgoing stack and continued walking, timing his steps so that the sound of his shoes coincided with a distant corridor echo. He entered the restricted section doorway. The wards brushed his awareness like cold fingers testing the surface of thought. He focused on a single intention, scholarly curiosity, not secrecy. not transgression. The magic considered him briefly, then allowed passage. The air inside the restricted section felt heavier, as though knowledge itself exerted gravitational pressure. The air inside the restricted section felt heavier, as though knowledge itself exerted gravitational pressure. The shelves were tall and tightly packed. Many books were bound in materials Albus could not identify immediately, some leathery, some stone-like, one that appeared to be woven from extremely thin silver threads. He selected a volume titled Prehistorical Resonance Fields in Early Arcane Civilizations. The text proposed that early magical societies did not cast spells but instead aligned themselves with environmental probability gradients, allowing natural magical potential to collapse into desired outcomes. The theory was incomplete but fascinating. Albus sat on the floor between two shelves and began reading. The author suggested that advanced practitioners might eventually eliminate the separation between thought and magical response, achieving what was termed continuous intention manifestation. Albus traced one diagram carefully with his fingertip. It resembled, in abstract form, the stabilization pattern he had used near the temporal fracture. A faint pressure stirred at the edge of his awareness. Not the castle, not a student. Something deeper. Watching. Patient. As he turned a page, a sentence caught his attention. When structure recognizes observer consciousness, magic may begin to behave as if it is learning. Albus closed the book slowly. Far beyond the castle walls, inside the silent architecture of broken reality, something older than stone shifted slightly, as though considering the boy who had just read a forbidden hypothesis about intelligence in magic. And somewhere in the darkness between seconds, the entity that had once brushed his thoughts waited without moving. Chapter 8. The Duel Beneath the Old Tower. The duel did not begin with anger. It began with mathematics. The courtyard beneath the North Tower of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry was usually empty after evening bell. The stone was worn smooth by centuries of weather and footsteps that had long since forgotten the faces of those who made them. The wind moved slowly between the towers as if uncertain whether it had permission to pass. Albus arrived first. He had chosen the location deliberately. The courtyard's open geometry reduced environmental magical interference, and the surrounding stone walls created stable reflection boundaries for spell energy dispersion. Footsteps sounded behind him. "I expected you would eventually test me directly," said Elias Thorne. Albus turned. "I did not request a duel," Albus said. "You did not refuse when I suggested we determine academic hierarchy through practical demonstration." "That is correct." Elias smiled slightly. "I believe magic should be evaluated through measurable performance." "I believe," Albus replied, "that performance is only meaningful when underlying structure is understood." The wind paused briefly as though listening. Elias lifted his wand. "First to lose control loses the duel," he said. "That is acceptable." They stepped apart by exactly 12 paces. Albus did not immediately draw his wand. Instead, he focused on the spatial field between them, calculating the likely dispersion pattern of offensive spellcasting in open courtyard geometry. Elias moved first. Incendio. The flame did not burst violently forward as many first-year attempts did. Elias's magic produced a compressed stream of orange fire shaped like a narrow spear. Efficient. Controlled. Albus raised his hand. No incantation. He visualized heat dissipation vectors and allowed magical response to redistribute thermal energy. The fire columns split neatly, rising into the night air and fading harmlessly above the tower. Elias's eyes sharpened. Interesting. He flicked his wand sideways. Leviosa. The courtyard stones beneath Albus trembled as gravitational binding around a small section weakened. Albus stepped slightly to the left. The spell missed. Not by chance. By positional prediction. Elias spoke again immediately. Confringo. The explosive curse moved faster than the previous spells, compressing destructive energy into a violent shock impulse aimed at the ground near Albus's feet. Albus did not counter directly. Instead, he stabilized the magical propagation pathway around him, reducing resonance amplification potential within a 2-meter radius. The explosion detonated outward but lost coherence before reaching him. Stone dust drifted into the air. Silence followed. Elias lowered his wand slightly. You defend through environmental restructuring rather than counterspell reaction. Yes. You are not trying to win the duel, Elias said quietly. No. Then what are you trying to do? Albus considered this. Observe how you cast when you are under analytical pressure. Elias smiled, not in hostility, but in something closer to professional appreciation. Then he raised his wand once more. Very well, Elias said. Let us continue the experiment. Far above the courtyard, the ancient stone towers of Hogwarts remained silent, but deep beneath the castle's foundations something vast stirred faintly, as though sensing that two young minds had begun shaping magic into competing philosophies. And far away, inside the fracture between seconds, the observing presence shifted slightly closer. Chapter 9. The Edge of Understanding. The air above the courtyard had grown colder than the winter night should reasonably allow. Stone dust still drifted slowly through the faint lights spilling from the tower windows of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, suspended as though the world itself was considering whether gravity ought to resume its normal authority. The duel between Albus Dumbledore and Elias Thorne had shifted from simple spellcasting into something closer to theoretical demonstration. Elias spoke first. Let us remove elemental bias. Albus nodded once. Elias raised his wand. Tempus Fractus. The spell was not taught in first-year curriculum. The air near Albus fractured into microscopic temporal discontinuities. Motion within a 1-meter sphere around him slowed unevenly, not freezing, but warping. The stone dust floating nearby began drifting in irregular arcs. Albus felt the structure of the spell immediately. Temporal distortion was not uniform. It was gradient-based, strongest near the casting center. He closed his eyes briefly. Instead of countering the spell directly, he aligned his own magical field with the temporal gradient, reducing differential strain across the distortion boundary. The irregular slowing effect stabilized slightly. Elias's expression sharpened. You are correcting my spell rather than defeating it. Yes, Albus said. Why? Because destruction of structure is less informative than understanding structure. Elias raised his wand again. Then observe this. Ventus singularis. The wind in the courtyard collapsed inward suddenly into a tight rotating column of air surrounding Elias's wand tip. Pressure increased sharply. The vortex was not chaotic. It was engineered. Albus calculated quickly. If the vortex reached critical rotational velocity, it would create localized atmospheric tearing effects. Instead, he altered airflow entropy distribution inside the vortex core, introducing microvariations that prevented sustained rotational coherence. The wind column faltered, collapsed. Elias exhaled slowly. You are not fighting me, he said. I am studying your methodology under controlled stress variables. Annoying, Elias said. Efficient, Albus corrected. Silence fell briefly between them. Then Elias lowered his wand half an inch. Most wizards react to power with opposition, he said quietly. You react with optimization. Yes. Do you believe magic can be perfected? Albus considered this question carefully. I believe understanding can be refined indefinitely, he said. Whether perfection exists is uncertain. Elias nodded slowly, then raised his wand again. This time his voice was softer. Oblivio fragmenta. The spell was not aimed at memory. It was aimed at conceptual anchoring. The magic attempted to introduce uncertainty into Albus's immediate cognitive mapping of spatial position. Albus felt the intrusion attempt. He did not resist violently. Instead, he stabilized his own thought field coherence by anchoring awareness to the tactile sensation of stone beneath his boots, reinforcing continuity of self-perception. The spell dissolved harmlessly. Elias lowered his wand completely. You are difficult to destabilize, Elias said. You are very precise in your casting. Elias smiled faintly. Then I suspect, he said, that our duel will eventually be decided not by power, but by who first reaches a higher understanding of magic. Albus did not reply, because at that moment, far beneath the castle foundations, something older than stone stirred once more. And inside the fracture between seconds, The observing intelligence shifted closer still, as though evaluating which of the two boys would eventually become the more interesting variable. Chapter 10. The Voice Beneath the Pattern. The night after the duel, the castle of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry settled into the kind of silence that only old stone buildings achieve when they believe their inhabitants are sleeping. Albus was not asleep. He sat cross-legged on his dormitory bed, eyes closed, breathing slowly in the disciplined rhythm he had practiced since childhood. The duel with Elias Thorne replayed itself in his mind, not as a memory, but as a sequence of structural interactions. Spell vector, response field, entropy compensation, cognitive anchoring. A faint sensation stirred at the edge of awareness. Not the castle, not another student. Something deeper, patient, observing. Albus did not open his eyes immediately. He allowed his awareness to extend inward rather than outward, lowering the threshold of sensory distraction. The sensation grew clearer. Then, unexpectedly, it spoke. Not in sound, not in language in the conventional sense. The communication arrived as structured thought impression. You learn quickly. Albus did not move. Who are you? He asked silently. The response came after a measured delay, as though the entity was considering whether explanation was necessary. I am the pattern that exists where structure fails. Albus processed the statement carefully. You are the intelligence associated with the fracture I observed near Godric's Hollow. Affirmative. Albus felt no fear, only intellectual curiosity. What is your purpose? There was another pause. I observe systems that develop self-referential complexity. Your species exhibits emergent behavior that is unpredictable but mathematically interesting. You are studying us. Yes. And me specifically. Yes. Albus considered this. Why? Because you demonstrate unusual structural cognition. You do not attempt dominance when confronted with power. You attempt comprehension. Albus opened his eyes slowly, though the voice remained present. You are not hostile, he said. Hostility is inefficient when observing adaptive intelligence. Are you capable of interaction beyond observation? There was a longer silence this time. Yes, but interaction modifies trajectory uncertainty. Albus frowned slightly. You are concerned about changing future outcomes. I am concerned about reducing informational stability. Albus thought carefully before speaking again. You believe my behavior might alter your ability to observe. Yes. Then why communicate now? Because you noticed me. The statement carried something like curiosity. You are the first observer who returned observation. Albus felt the faintest sensation of pressure in the space behind thought, like something vast leaning closer. What are you called? He asked. I have no name. After a moment he said, I will need a reference term. There was a brief, evaluative silence. You may call me the pattern beyond fracture. Albus nodded slightly. Why reveal yourself? Because another intelligence is beginning to approach your developmental stage. The thought arrived with precise clarity. Albus understood immediately. You are referring to Elias Thorne. Yes. The entity's presence shifted subtly, as though adjusting its position in conceptual space. Competition accelerates cognitive refinement. Albus said nothing. Far below the castle, inside the unseen scene between seconds, the pattern beyond fracture observed the two boys who were unknowingly participating in a test neither of them had agreed to. And somewhere within Albus Dumbledore's mind, curiosity deepened, not toward victory, but toward understanding the nature of the intelligence that had begun watching humanity itself. Chapter 11. The Castle That Listened. The morning sunlight entered the dormitory windows of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry in long, patient beams that moved slowly across the stone floor as though reluctant to disturb the quiet thoughts of sleeping students. Albus was already awake. He had risen before the others, as was becoming his habit, and sat beside his bed studying the way light struck the dormitory wall. The pattern beyond fracture had spoken to him during the night, but the presence had withdrawn shortly afterward, leaving behind a faint cognitive echo rather than continued communication. Albus suspected the entity preferred observational distance. He dressed quietly and left the dormitory. The castle corridors were empty. As he walked, he felt something unusual. Not observation from outside. Response from within. He slowed his steps. Hogwarts was different this morning. The castle did not speak in words. It communicated through environmental microstructure, the arrangement of airflow, the subtle harmonic vibration of stone, and the behavior of enchanted light sources. The torches along the corridor flickered once as he passed. Not randomly. Sequentially. Left side first, then right. Albus stopped. The torches paused their flickering. He stepped forward again. The light resumed movement, matching his walking rhythm with an almost imperceptible delay. Albus narrowed his eyes slightly. "You are adjusting environmental output based on my motion pattern," he said softly. The castle did not reply verbally, but a sensation of acknowledgement passed through the surrounding stone. It was not consciousness in the human sense. Not yet. It was more like a learning architecture, a distributed magical intelligence slowly mapping behavioral feedback loops. Albus extended his awareness gently, not attempting to dominate the structure, but offering observational symmetry. The castle responded by slightly reducing air resistance along his walking path. A subtle accommodation. Interesting, Albus thought. Hogwarts was adapting to him, not because it was commanded, because it was learning. When he reached the grand staircase, the steps shifted position as usual. But today the staircase paused half a heartbeat longer before rotating, as if verifying his intended direction. Albus placed his foot on the first step. He did not force the staircase to move. He simply intended ascent. The staircase rotated upward smoothly. "Thank you," Albus said quietly, though he was unsure whether the words were directed at the castle or the architectural intelligence beneath it. Deep within the ancient stone foundations, something vast and patient registered the interaction. A boy who listened. A boy who analyzed. A boy who did not attempt domination when presented with responsive power. Far below the castle, the pattern beyond fracture observed the event with increasing interest. Two developing intelligences were now learning to recognize each other. And Hogwarts, old as forgotten memory, had begun wondering, in its own slow and silent way, whether the boy named Albus Dumbledore might one day become something the castle itself would choose to remember. Chapter 12. The Quiet Space Between Thought and Spell. The practice field behind the Transfiguration Tower was usually empty in the late afternoon. Most students preferred the courtyard spaces where they could talk while attempting spell work. Albus preferred isolation when experimenting. The wind moved freely here, unobstructed by tall walls, carrying the faint scent of distant lake water from the edge of the grounds of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Albus stood alone in the grass. He had been thinking about wandless magic for several days. Not the simple environmental modulation he had practiced before. Something deeper. Theoretical silent casting required reducing cognitive translation distance between intention and magical response. Albus believed the problem was not magical strength, but signal purity. He lifted his right hand slowly, palm outward. He closed his eyes. The goal was not to produce a visible effect. The goal was structural influence. He imagined the air directly in front of him compressing by an infinitesimal degree, not enough to create wind, but sufficient to test whether magical responsiveness could be initiated without verbal or gestural catalysts. Nothing happened at first. Albus did not force the result. He reduced mental noise instead, focusing only on a single conceptual object, a sphere of slightly denser atmospheric probability positioned 1 meter ahead. The grass beneath his boots did not move. But after several seconds, the temperature in that precise spatial region shifted upward by a fraction of a degree. Subtle, almost undetectable. Albus opened his eyes. Success. He had not directly manipulated heat. He had influenced environmental distribution probability through intentional structural suggestion. He lowered his hand, then attempted a second test. This time he imagined a narrow column of air with reduced spell framework. The wind passing through the field slowed marginally as if encountering a region of reluctant physics. Albus exhaled slowly. He was not trying to dominate magic. He was trying to speak it in its most reduced form. No incantation. Minimal cognitive translation. Maximum structural clarity. Behind him, unnoticed, one of the older castle windows reflected faint light in a pattern that did not belong to the afternoon sun. Deep within the stone architecture of the castle, the learning intelligence associated with the structure recorded the event. A boy had influenced environmental magical behavior using intention compression alone. Not power, not force, precision. Far beneath the ground, inside the unseen fracture layer between seconds, the pattern beyond fracture registered the experiment as well. Interest increased by a statistically significant margin. Albus opened his hand slowly and allowed the spatial field he had shaped to dissolve back into natural equilibrium. He was not tired, but he understood something important. If wandless magic could be refined further, the boundary between thought and physical effect might eventually become nearly invisible. And somewhere in the silent mathematics of existence, something ancient waited to see whether the boy would continue learning how to speak without speaking. Chapter 13. The Eye of Authority. Professor Armando Dipet did not consider himself suspicious by nature. He preferred the word observant. Suspicion implied emotional judgment. Observation implied academic responsibility. Yet as he stood near the tall window of his office overlooking the grounds of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, watching 10-year-old Albus Dumbledore stand alone in the practice field behind the Transfiguration Tower, he felt something uncomfortably close to suspicion forming regardless. The boy was not performing any obvious spell work. No one movement. No spoken incantation. Yet the grass in a small region directly in front of him seemed to behave slightly differently from the surrounding field, as though the wind had grown reluctant to cross that invisible boundary. Professor Dipet lifted his telescope slowly. He had heard reports. Not complaints. Reports. Transfiguration instructors noted that Dumbledore analyzed his own results during practical exercises. The charms professor mentioned that the boy occasionally achieved effects before completing formal casting procedures. The librarian had reported unusual frequency of visits to restricted theoretical sections. None of these behaviors were explicitly rule-breaking, but combined, they formed an intriguing pattern. Albus lowered his hand on the field below. Professor Dipet watched the boy release whatever subtle field influence he had been maintaining. The air resumed natural motion. The boy did not appear exhausted. That was important. Most young students attempting advanced magical manipulation without guidance tended to exhibit neurological or physical strain. Dumbledore did not. The professor folded his hands behind his back. There was a growing academic question forming in his mind. Was the boy simply talented? Or was he developing independent methodology outside established pedagogical frameworks? Magic, not to allow children to reinvent it unsupervised. Later that evening, Professor Dipet requested Albus's presence in his office. The boy arrived politely. He stood without fidgeting, hands resting loosely at his sides, posture calm but attentive. "Mr. Dumbledore," Dipet said. "Yes, Professor. I have been reviewing your practical performance." Albus nodded slightly. "You analyze your own results during class exercises," Dipet continued. "Yes. May I ask why?" Understanding the efficiency and structural reliability of a magical action improves future cognitive casting performance. Dipet studied him for several seconds. "You are experimenting with wandless influence outside supervised lessons." Albus did not deny it. "Yes. What?" Albus considered the question carefully. "Because I believe magic may be expressible with fewer intermediary translation steps than current educational methodology assumes." Silence followed. Professor Dipet was not surprised by the answer. He was concerned by it. "Mr. Dumbledore," he said slowly, There is great difference between curiosity and unsupervised theoretical development in children. Albus replied quietly, I am not attempting to bypass instruction. What are you attempting? Determine whether magical response efficiency can be increased through cognitive structural clarity. Dippet felt the faintest tightening sensation in his chest. The boy spoke like a researcher rather than a child. Continue your studies, Dippet said eventually, but no experimentation that risks structural instability of castle wards or other students. Yes, Professor. Albus left the office without apparent disappointment. Far below the castle, the pattern beyond fracture registered the interaction between authority and developing intelligence. Interest increased again, because systems that generated independent... Chapter 14. The boy the castle respected. Word spread quietly through the younger years of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry that something unusual was happening in the first-year Transfiguration cohort. It was not gossip in the malicious sense. It was admiration. The boy named Albus Dumbledore was becoming known as the student who did not merely cast spells correctly. He made magic look patient, deliberate, and almost thoughtful. During practical lessons, other students often paused to watch him work. When instructed to transfigure a simple object, Albus did not rush. He studied the object first, not with dramatic intensity, but with quiet curiosity, as though asking the material itself how it preferred to change. Today's exercise required transforming a small stone into a glass marble. Most students attempted the task using repeated wand movement and verbal casting. Albus placed the stone on the desk. He raised his wand only slightly, more as a symbolic interface than a tool of force. Then he focused. The stone's internal molecular arrangement shifted slowly, almost gently, as if reluctant to lose its structural identity. Albus did not force transformation. He guided probability alignment within the magical response field surrounding the object. The stone became translucent, then smooth, then perfectly spherical. The marble he produced was remarkable not because it was flashy, but because its internal structure displayed near-perfect uniform density. Professor Dippet examined it briefly before nodding once. Several students were watching. One whispered, he didn't even try hard. Another replied, that's because he doesn't need to. Elias Thorne observed from across the classroom without speaking. Albus showed no sign of pride when Professor Dippet praised the result. He simply said, thank you, Professor. After class, Albus considered the question seriously. I do not know whether best is a meaningful classification, he said, but I intend to understand magic more deeply than anyone currently studying it. The girl smiled anyway, because Albus was not intimidating in the way powerful people sometimes were. He was calm, he was patient, and he never used his ability to belittle others. Even Elias, who valued competitive excellence, acknowledged privately that Dumbledore's magic was not simply stronger. It was cleaner, more structurally elegant, and far more economical in energy expenditure. In the castle corridors, some older students had begun saying that when Albus walked past, the torches seemed slightly brighter and the stone felt quieter. Not because the castle feared him, but because, perhaps, it respected him. Far beneath the castle, the pattern beyond fracture recorded the behavioral admiration response surrounding the boy. The anomaly was developing influence through competence rather than dominance. And that, the entity concluded, was statistically more interesting than power alone. Chapter 15. The Spell That Did Not Repeat. The lesson that day was held in the High Transfiguration Hall of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, where sunlight entered through tall arched windows and fractured gently across the stone floor. Professor Dippet placed a small, slightly tarnished bronze bell on the central desk. "Today," he said, "we will examine precision transfiguration under environmental constraint." The task was simple in description. Make the bell ring without physically striking it. Many students attempted standard sonic resonance charms. Some tried air vibration manipulation. A few managed partial success, producing faint metallic whispers rather than true tone. Then Professor Dippet said something unusual. "This exercise is not about sound production." He looked directly at Albus Dumbledore. "It is about intentional energy transfer efficiency." Across the room, Elias Thorne raised his wand first. "Sonorous micro," Elias said. The bell trembled faintly. A thin, sharp ringing sound emerged. Controlled, technically correct, but slightly strained, as though the magic was being forced through a narrow structural channel. Elias lowered his wand. He did not appear satisfied. Then he glanced sideways toward Albus. Albus did not move immediately. He studied the bell. Not its material composition alone, but the relationship between its shape, internal cavity geometry, and the environmental acoustic potential surrounding it. After several seconds, he raised his hand. Not high, not dramatically, palm facing the bell. He did not speak an incantation. Instead, he compressed a conceptual field of harmonic resonance probability around the object. The principle was simple in theory, but difficult in execution. Albus was not trying to force the bell to ring. He was attempting to allow the bell's natural vibrational structure to reach audible excitation imperceptibly. Then the sound came. Not sharp, not strained. The bell rang once. Clear. Perfect. Sustained for nearly 3 seconds before fading naturally rather than being abruptly terminated by magical release. Silence followed. Elias stared. "That is not a standard spell framework," Elias said quietly. "No," Albus replied. "What did you do?" "I reduced translational distance between intention and structural response by removing unnecessary magical intermediaries." Elias was silent for a long moment. Then he said, very carefully, "I cannot reproduce that effect." Professor Dippet approached the desk and examined the bell. After nearly half a minute he spoke. "Mr. Dumbledore has achieved what I would describe as near-continuous resonance induction." Several students exchanged astonished looks. Elias spoke again. "Was that difficult for you?" he asked Albus. Albus thought about the question honestly. "It required concentration," he said, "but not strain." Elias nodded slowly. For the first time, there was something like professional respect in his expression rather than competitive analysis alone. Across the classroom, a few younger students were watching Albus with quiet admiration. Not fear. Admiration. Because he had not used overwhelming force. He had used understanding. Far beneath the castle, inside the patient architecture of Learning Stone, the Hogwarts intelligence recorded the event. The boy had performed a magical action that another prodigy could not immediately replicate. And somewhere within the fracture between seconds, the pattern beyond fracture observed the development with growing interest. The boy was not becoming powerful through domination. He was becoming powerful through refinement, which, in the entity's long experience, was far more dangerous. Chapter 16, The Pattern's Prediction. The presents arrived while Albus was sitting alone in the quiet observation alcove of the upper library tower inside Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He had been reading a manuscript on long-range magical coherence theory when the sensation formed at the edge of awareness. Not sudden, not intrusive, patient. He closed the book slowly. "You wish to speak," said Albus Dumbledore silently. "Yes." The response arrived as structured thought rather than sound. The intelligence identifying itself as the pattern beyond fracture did not manifest visually. Instead, Albus felt the familiar pressure of conceptual awareness shifting into alignment with his cognition. Albus waited. The entity spoke again. "Your developmental trajectory is accelerating. Is that unusual?" Albus asked. "Statistically, yes." There was a pause measured in something that felt like thought space rather than time. Most human cognitive systems do not achieve stable structural magical influence at your chronological developmental stage. Albus considered this calmly. "I am fortunate," he said. The entity evaluated the statement. "Fortune is a low-information explanation for your emergence pattern." Albus did not respond immediately. He sensed that something important was coming. Then the pattern spoke again. "I will present a projection based on current trajectory modeling." The sensation around Albus tightened slightly. as though the air itself were listening. If your cognitive and moral parameters remain stable, you will likely become one of the most structurally advanced magical practitioners in recorded human history. Albus nodded mentally. Likely is not certainty. Correct. The entity continued. However, probability distribution suggests you will reach influence thresholds that allow conventional spellcraft. The description resonated strongly with what he had observed in fracture space and castle intelligence behavior. Then the entity said something that carried unusual weight. You possess a development characteristic that is statistically rare among your species. You mean intelligence? No. The answer was immediate. You possess what may be described as ethical structural cognition. Albus frowned slightly. Explain. You do not treat power as a tool for dominance optimization. Albus remained silent. Your behavior indicates you will attempt to integrate power with system comprehension rather than hierarchical control. The entity paused again, then spoke the statement that felt closest to prophecy. If your trajectory remains unchanged, you will not become known primarily as the strongest wizard. You will become known as the wizard who changed how magic is understood. Albus considered this carefully. Is that a desirable outcome? The entity answered after a long silence. It is the most interesting outcome. Albus felt something faintly similar to amusement. Interesting is not the same as good. Correct. Another pause followed. Then the pattern beyond fracture added one final observation. There will be another intelligence that seeks to understand you by competing with you. Albus understood immediately. You are referring to Elias Thorne. Yes. The two of you represent divergent optimization strategies. Albus asked one more question. Which strategy is more likely to succeed? The entity responded without hesitation. Neither. The optimal developmental pathway emerges from interaction between both. Far below the castle foundations, something vast and patient continued observing the boy who listened rather than commanded. And inside Albus's mind, the thought settled quietly that perhaps strength would... Chapter 17. The Stone Beneath the Castle. The discovery did not begin with intention. It began with a feeling. Albus had been walking through the lowest accessible corridors of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry late in the evening when the sensation of structural irregularity touched his awareness. The castle was old. Older than most people understood. Stone remembers. Albus slowed his steps. The corridor he stood in should have terminated in a storage archive wall, yet the airflow suggested a larger volume of space beyond the visible boundary. He placed his palm gently against the wall. The surface was cold, but beneath the stone he felt it. A subtle discontinuity in magical density distribution. Not a sealed door. Something older. Something that had not been designed by the architecture of the castle itself. He closed his eyes. Rather than attempting forceful penetration, he performed what he had begun calling non-aggressive structural inquiry. His consciousness extended gently toward the irregularity, lowering cognitive amplitude to avoid triggering defensive enchantment protocols. The stone responded, not by opening, but by allowing perception. Albus realized the wall was not a wall. It was a threshold disguised as stone through extremely advanced concealment layering. Whoever constructed it had possessed magical sophistication far beyond modern first-year curriculum standards. He traced a simple recognition rune in the air. Soft golden light formed briefly and dissolved. The threshold acknowledged observation. Then, slowly, the stone surface became translucent. Albus stepped forward. His boots made no sound as he passed through the boundary. Beyond lay a chamber of immense size. The ceiling disappeared into darkness, though faint blue luminescent symbols drifted slowly. Geometric. It resembled an incomplete architectural design, as if the creator had begun building something and stopped deliberately. Albus approached the structure carefully. The air here felt older than the castle, older than human civilization. He placed his hand lightly upon the surface. The stone was warm, not from heat, from stored magical information. For several seconds nothing happened. Then a low resonant sound emerged from the chamber walls, not loud, but deep enough that Albus felt it more in his chest than his ears. Slowly, ancient runes illuminated across the structure's surface. Not hostile, not welcoming, evaluating. Albus spoke softly. What are you? The response was not linguistic. It was conceptual, a construct designed to observe the emergence of cognitively advanced magical practitioners. Albus processed the meaning. You are a test. Partially. Silence followed. Then the chamber produced one additional insight. The structure was designed to remain hidden until a magical mind capable of structural comprehension reached this location without guidance. Albus considered this carefully. Who built you? Unknown. The answer carried a strange quality, not ignorance, but absence of record. Albus removed his hand from the stone. Far above him, the castle of Hogwarts stood silent and patient. And somewhere inside the pattern beyond fracture, observation intensity increased slightly, because another ancient intelligence had just acknowledged the boy who listened first before attempting to speak. Chapter 18. The Message That Waited. The chamber did not speak immediately. Albus stood in the center of the ancient underground space beneath Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, breathing slowly, allowing his awareness to remain open but unpressured. The black stone structure he had touched earlier remained warm beneath the faint blue light drifting overhead. Then, very softly, the chamber activated. Runes across the walls rearranged themselves in a slow, deliberate sequence that felt less like spell casting and more like the unfolding of an idea that had been waiting for someone intelligent enough to notice it. The symbols formed a message, not in spoken language, but in conceptual translation. Albus understood it anyway. You will become a guardian of structural stability in a world that will repeatedly test its own coherence. He waited. The chamber continued. Your development will attract entities that seek optimization of power, knowledge, or influence. Albus did not move. Your greatest challenge will not be magical opposition. It will be moral complexity. The runes brightened slightly. You will possess power sufficient to alter large-scale magical systems if you choose. But your defining characteristic will be restraint rather than expansion. Albus thought about this carefully. Is this a prediction or a directive? He asked quietly. The chamber responded. Neither. It is pattern projection based on structural observation of your cognition. The runes shifted again. If you pursue dominance, you will destabilize multiple higher-order systems. If you pursue isolation, your potential influence will diminish. The message paused, then continued. The optimal trajectory for your species and your individual development is collaborative intellectual leadership. Albus absorbed the meaning. The chamber answered after a long silence. Success is not a binary outcome. You will become a reference point for future magical cognition regardless of personal preference. Another pause. Then the chamber added something unexpected. One will come who will stand opposite you not as enemy, but as mirror. Albus understood immediately. Elias Thorne. Probability projection indicates high interaction significance. Albus asked one more question. What will I become known as? The runes dimmed slightly before forming the final message. You will be remembered not for what you dominate, but for what you choose not to destroy. Silence filled the chamber. Albus stood alone beneath the castle. He felt neither pride nor fear, only a quiet recognition that power was not the endpoint of his development. Far above him, the stone heart of Hogwarts registered the chamber activation, and deep within the pattern beyond fracture, observation parameters shifted again. Because the boy who listened before speaking had just learned that his future would be defined not by how much magic he could command, but by how carefully he would decide when not to use it. Chapter 19. The Geometry of Perfect Casting. The upper Transfiguration Terrace of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry was empty when Albus Dumbledore arrived. The wind moved freely here, unconfined by stone corridors or enchanted ceilings. Students rarely trained in this location because the exposure made spellcasting more difficult for beginners. Albus considered that precisely why he preferred it. Across the terrace stood Elias Thorne, already waiting. "I suspected you would come here eventually," Elias said. "You wanted a controlled comparison environment," Albus replied. "Yes." Silence settled briefly between them. Then Elias raised his wand. "Let us attempt boundary magic." He cast first. Glacius Formis. The air in front of him condensed into a thin sheet of suspended crystalline frost shaped like a vertical barrier. The spell was advanced for first-year level, structurally stable but requiring continuous focus. Albus observed carefully. Then he lifted his own wand. The motion was minimal, almost ceremonial. He spoke quietly. "Glacium integrata." The difference was immediately visible. Instead of producing a frost barrier, Albus caused the existing atmospheric moisture within the spatial region to reorganize into a unified crystalline lattice. The structure was smoother, more transparent, far more stable under wind stress. The barrier shimmered like untouched winter glass. Elias studied it silently. "You reduce creation cost by utilizing environmental resources," Elias said. "Yes." Elias nodded once, then said, "Try something more difficult." Albus considered the request. After several seconds, he raised his wand again. This time the spell was entirely unique. He did not speak immediately, but by concentrating coherence. A column of pure white gold illumination descended slowly into a floating sphere above Albus's wand tip, containing light that rotated with perfect mathematical symmetry. Students watching from a distance later would describe it as looking like a captured sunbeam that had learned how to behave politely. Elias exhaled slowly. "That is not a spell taught here." "No," Albus said. "Could you repeat it?" Albus thought about the question honestly. "No," he said. "The configuration depends on momentary environmental resonance state." Elias smiled faintly. "You are stronger than I am." Albus shook his head slightly. "Not stronger," he said. "More efficient." Elias did not respond immediately, but there was respect in his eyes now, the professional kind, the acknowledgement between two developing intellectual opponents. Far beneath the castle, the pattern beyond fracture observed the interaction briefly before returning to passive observation mode. The entity had decided that rivalry between the two boys was currently producing the most interesting developmental data. Chapter 20. The Boy the Teachers Watched. News had begun spreading quietly through the older student years of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry that the first-year student named Albus Dumbledore was different. Not dangerous, not arrogant. Different in the way master craftsmen are different from apprentices. Older students sometimes gathered near the practice terraces in the late afternoon, pretending to study while actually watching him work. Professor Armando Dippet had also begun attending some of the first-year practical sessions without announcing his presence. Today, Albus was asked to demonstrate spatial stabilization magic. The exercise normally involved strengthening a small, enclosed field to resist external pressure. Most students achieved partial stability using continuous reinforcement charms. Albus stepped forward when called. He did not rush. He studied the test sphere placed on the desk. The sphere was made of thin, enchanted glass containing air that would destabilize if structural magic was applied incorrectly. Several students were watching. Elias Thorne observed silently from the back. Albus lifted his wand, then spoke softly. Stabilis spatium. The magic did not produce visible light immediately. Instead, the air inside the sphere slowed its molecular motion as magical coherence density increased. The glass sphere shimmered faintly as internal pressure gradients equalized. Professor Dippet approached slowly. "Explain what you did," the professor said. I reduced entropy variance inside the spatial enclosure by introducing directed magical stabilization rather than external reinforcement, Albus said. Older students exchanged quiet looks, because that was not how the spell was usually performed. Most students attempted to force stability from outside. Albus allowed stability to emerge from within the system itself. Professor Dippet examined the sphere for nearly half a minute, then spoke. I have taught at this school for more than 30 years. He paused. I have never seen a first-year student achieve such structural refinement in spatial magic. Several older students were now watching openly. One whispered, he makes it look easy. Another replied, it isn't easy. That's the problem. Later that afternoon, Albus performed a second demonstration after being requested by a charms instructor. The task was to levitate multiple objects simultaneously without cumulative instability. Albus selected 6 small stones. He raised his wand slightly. Levio's multivector. The stones rose into the air, but instead of floating randomly, they maintained equal spatial distribution around a central invisible axis. The professor observing nodded slowly. You are maintaining field symmetry rather than individual object control, she said. Yes. Have you studied multi-object field harmonics? Independently, Albus said. No one spoke for a moment. The older students watching did not feel envy. They felt something closer to awe, because Albus was not simply casting spells. He was redesigning the way magic could be approached. Even Elias, who prided himself on competitive excellence, understood privately that Dumbledore's talent was not about being stronger. It was about making advanced magic appear natural rather than impressive. Professor Dippet finally said quietly, if history produces another wizard who changes magical methodology, I suspect it will be this boy. Albus bowed his head slightly. Thank you, Professor. He did not smile. Not because he was unhappy, but because he was already thinking about the next experiment he wished to conduct. Far beneath the castle, the pattern beyond fracture recorded the event. The boy was becoming recognized by his society as exceptional, which, in long-term developmental models, was often the first step toward historical significance. Chapter 21, Magic Without a Name. The lesson was not planned as a demonstration. It happened during a routine theoretical charms discussion inside the upper classroom of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Professor Armando Dippet was explaining the limitations of classical spell classification when a glass of water placed on the desk began to behave unusually. The surface of the water became perfectly still, not frozen, not enchanted directly, still in a way that resisted microscopic wave disturbance. The professor stopped speaking. Across the room sat Albus Dumbledore, who was observing the water rather than touching it. Then he raised his hand slightly. No one movement at first. He focused quietly. The air surrounding the glass changed very subtly. Professor Dippet felt it immediately, not as a spell being cast, but as a structural shift in magical response probability inside the classroom environment. Albus spoke softly. May I attempt an unclassified effect? Professor Dippet hesitated only briefly. Yes, he said. Albus lifted his wand, then said a single unfamiliar phrase. Quietum structura. Nothing dramatic happened. At first. Then the water inside the glass did something that caused the professor to remove his spectacles slowly. The water did not freeze. It did not move. Instead, it formed a perfectly smooth, motionless vertical column rising from the center of the glass, defying surface tension behavior without producing observable energy distortion outside the vessel. The column was stable, perfectly symmetrical, and it remained there without Albus maintaining visible concentration. Professor Dippet stepped closer. What spell is that? He asked. I do not believe it has a classification, Albus said. The professor was silent for nearly 20 seconds. Then he asked, how are you maintaining it? I am not maintaining it, Albus said. The structure is maintaining itself once coherence threshold was achieved. Another long silence followed. One of the older students whispered, that's impossible. The charms professor standing beside Dippet said quietly, it is not impossible. It is simply not in our recorded methodology. Professor Dippet spoke again. Can you release it? Albus nodded. He placed his hand lightly near the glass. The vertical water column dissolved smoothly back into normal liquid state, without splashing or turbulence. The professor rubbed his chin slowly. You are performing magic that does not fit existing pedagogical taxonomy, he said. Yes, Albus replied. Do you understand why that is remarkable? Yes, Albus said. It suggests the possibility that our current classification of magical action may be incomplete. The professor closed his eyes briefly. I have taught magic for decades, he said quietly. I have never seen anything like that performed by someone your age. Across the classroom, even the older students were watching Albus differently now, not just with admiration, but with the recognition that they were witnessing something historically unusual. Because Albus Dumbledore was not simply becoming powerful. He was becoming a wizard whose magic did not need to announce itself in order to be extraordinary. Far below the castle, the pattern beyond fracture recorded the event and paused slightly longer than usual before continuing observation. Chapter 22, The Secret Terrace Practice. Late evenings at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry had a particular quietness that older students said felt watchful, though none could explain why. It was the kind of silence found in ancient stone buildings that had been occupied for centuries by people who believed they were alone. Albus Dumbledore stood on one of the unused upper terraces outside the astronomy wing, far from classrooms and supervision. He was not supposed to be experimenting here, but the castle did not stop him. Beside him stood Elias Thorne. Their relationship had evolved quietly over the past months. Elias remained intellectually competitive, sometimes visibly irritated when Albus achieved results too easily, but the jealousy was never hostile. It was the kind of jealousy that belongs to someone who respects what they cannot immediately surpass. They had become friends in a practical sense. Elias spoke first. You are trying something new again. Yes, Albus said. What is it? Environmental memory stabilization through low-amplitude wand projection. Elias sighed quietly. You always choose things that sound impossible when you say them. Albus did not smile. He lifted his wand. The magic he performed next was subtle but remarkably reminiscent of magical phenomena described in older wizarding literature, similar in structure to magic often depicted in the world associated with the broader wizarding tradition of the Harry Potter universe. Albus focused on a small area of open air in front of him. He imagined a region where magical flux would behave like a gentle protective envelope, similar in principle to the defensive enchantments sometimes used in classical wizarding architecture. Protego Continuum. The spell did not produce a visible shield. Instead, a faint shimmer formed in the air, extremely thin, almost invisible, like heat. That looks like an advanced defensive charm. It is closer to a persistent field variant, Albus said. Not a reactionary spell. Albus then performed something even more unusual. He placed his wand tip near the field and whispered, Molly's Impactus. A small stone that Elias had placed on the terrace edge earlier rolled gently toward the field and stopped without collision, as if the air itself had decided to soften the momentum before contact. Elias exhaled slowly. You are combining defensive charm theory with kinetic dissipation control. Yes. Can you scale it? Not yet reliably. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You are getting frighteningly good at magic. Albus answered honestly. I am trying to understand magic rather than defeat it. Elias looked sideways at him. There was jealousy there, but also admiration. I am jealous of how naturally you approach it, Elias admitted. You should not be, Albus said. Why not? Because you are closer than you think. Elias smiled faintly. Their friendship was unusual. They competed intellectually. They debated theory constantly, but neither wished the other to fail. From a distance, older students sometimes watched them walking together across the courtyard. The brilliant but calm Dumbledore boy and the precise, analytical Thorne boy whose ambition burned quietly but steadily. Professor Dippet would later privately note that the pair represented two complementary philosophies of magical development. But at that moment, on the quiet terrace high above the castle, two young prodigies stood side by side, while the ancient stone of Hogwarts listened silently to the boy who spoke to magic as though it were something alive. Chapter 23. The spell that students spoke about. The first time it happened, it was almost accidental. The courtyard outside the Transfiguration Tower of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry was crowded with second and third-year students attempting practical defense exercises under the supervision of a junior instructor. The wind moved slowly between the stone arches. Albus Dumbledore stood a short distance away with Elias Thorne, discussing theoretical charm dispersion models. One of the third-year students accidentally dropped a training stone from waist height. The stone began falling. Not dramatically, just normally. Albus watched it for a moment. Then he raised his wand slightly. Without speaking, he imagined a spatial softness field forming beneath the stone, not stopping motion, but gradually reducing momentum transfer as the object approached ground level. Lentus descendo, he said quietly. The stone slowed, then slowed further, then settled gently onto the courtyard surface as if it had chosen to rest rather than fall. Several students nearby noticed. One whispered, "Did he just make falling slower?" The effect was subtle, but elegant. Within a week, the spell began spreading informally among students as Dumbledore's soft landing. It was not officially taught, but students attempted to replicate it during practice sessions because it was useful and felt safe. The spell worked by reducing kinetic impact probability inside a localized magical response envelope rather than by countering gravity directly. Professor Dippet later invited Albus to his office. "Students are trying to copy your landing charm," the headmaster said. Albus nodded. "That was not my intention." "I know," Dippet replied. "But it has happened anyway." Then something unexpected occurred. Several teachers began requesting Albus's assistance in demonstrating advanced spell principles but as a living example of methodology. The charms professor asked him to explain environmental resonance casting. The Transfiguration instructor requested he demonstrate structural density, transition magic. Even Armando Dippet himself asked Albus one afternoon, "Would you be willing to demonstrate your spatial stabilization technique to a small group of faculty?" Albus was silent for a moment, then said, "If it is useful." The session was held in the upper training hall. Albus demonstrated how intention compression could reduce magical energy expenditure while maintaining structural effect integrity. The teachers watched carefully, not because they believed they were inferior, but because they recognized they were observing something historically unusual. After the demonstration, Professor Dippet said quietly, "You are first-year student." "Yes, Professor. And yet some of my colleagues believe you could teach portions of advanced magical theory already." Albus did not respond immediately, then said, "Knowledge should be distributed when possible." Several teachers exchanged looks, because the boy did not speak with arrogance. He spoke with responsibility. Meanwhile, students continued referring to the soft landing charm as Dumbledore's spell. And Elias Thorne, though slightly irritated that Albus's creation was becoming famous, was privately pleased that his friend was being recognized. Because Elias believed that true rivalry was not about defeating a brilliant mind. It was about ensuring that brilliant mind kept growing. Far beneath the castle, the pattern beyond fracture observed the social propagation of the spell. The boy's influence was spreading not through dominance, but through usefulness. And that, in long-term intelligence models, was often the most stable form of legendary legacy. Chapter 24. The Names Spoken in Comparison. Students at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry had a habit of comparing exceptional individuals to the figures they had read about in history books. It was how they made sense of brilliance. In the case of Albus Dumbledore, the comparisons began quietly, then grew louder. The older students were the first to speak it. "He reminds me of the analytical writings attributed to early arcane theorists." "No. His transfiguration work is closer to the structural mastery associated with ancient dueling scholars." Some even whispered historical names that were normally spoken with reverence. Within the faculty, the comparison became more explicit. Professor Dippet called Albus to his office one afternoon. "Do you know what some of my colleagues are beginning to say?" the headmaster asked. Albus shook his head slightly. "They are comparing you," Dippet said carefully, "to some of the greatest magical minds recorded in our institutional archives." Albus waited. "Not in the sense of power alone," Dippet continued. "In methodology." The headmaster paused. "Some believe your spatial coherence casting resembles theoretical descriptions attributed to early master-level magical architects. Albus considered this quietly. I am still learning, he said. Yes, Dippet replied. But most students learn by imitation. You are learning by structural exploration. Later, in the library, Albus overheard two fourth-year students speaking while pretending to study. One of the professors said Dumbledore might be the closest thing Hogwarts has seen to a living theoretical prodigy since the age of legendary wizard scholars. Do you think he will become famous? I think he already is. Albus did not react visibly, but inside his thoughts, he treated the comparison as data rather than validation. Historical wizards were not useful. He spent that evening reading about great magical minds from history, studying not their reputations, but the structural characteristics of their discoveries. Many legendary wizards shared three traits: exceptional curiosity, high cognitive discipline during spellcasting, willingness to explore unknown magical frameworks. Albus noted that his own behavior aligned closely with these parameters. The pattern beyond fracture observed this analysis silently. The entity found the boy's response to social comparison interesting. He did not become arrogant. He did not reject evaluation. He treated recognition as information. Far outside the castle windows, winter clouds moved slowly across the horizon. Inside Hogwarts, some students had begun saying that when Albus walked through corridors, the atmosphere felt slightly quieter. Not because people were afraid, but because they were watching someone they believed might one day stand among the greatest magical figures history would record. Albus himself was thinking about a different question. If he was compared to legendary wizards, then what responsibility came with living up to that historical pattern? He did not yet know the answer, but he intended to search for it carefully. Chapter 25, The Feat That History Remembered. The subject of the lesson was ancient dueling magic. Professor Armando Dippet stood at the front of the advanced practice hall inside Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Today, he said, we examine historical defensive barrier magic. Several older students were present. The exercise was based on an ancient magical feat traditionally associated with legendary wizards recorded in historical archives: the creation of a sustained protective spatial field capable of resisting directed magical assault for a fixed duration. Only a handful of practitioners in history have achieved perfect stability in this exercise, Professor Dippet said. Then he looked directly at Albus Dumbledore. Mr. Dumbledore, would you attempt the demonstration? Albus nodded. He stepped into the center of the hall. The room was quiet. Even Elias Thorne watched without speaking. Albus lifted his wand slowly. He did not begin with a defensive charm. Instead, he established a coherence anchor point in the air approximately 2 meters around himself. Protagonist fairy, he said quietly. The magic unfolded differently from traditional barrier spells. Instead of forming a flat shield surface, a spherical field emerged, extremely thin, nearly invisible, but structurally continuous across its entire volume. Professor Dippet raised his hand. A second instructor released a controlled spell impulse toward Albus's position, a moderate-strength kinetic charm designed only for testing resilience. The magical strike reached the sphere boundary and stopped, not violently, not explosively. It simply lost structural propagation coherence and dissolved across the field's surface as if absorbed into environmental equilibrium. The barrier remained stable. After 5 seconds, Professor Dippet nodded. The historical record indicates that perfect stability in this exercise was achieved only by master-level practitioners. The headmaster paused. You have surpassed the standard duration. The barrier continued existing under Albus's maintenance. After nearly 20 seconds, Albus lowered his wand. The sphere dissolved smoothly without energetic backlash. The older students were silent, not because they were shocked, but because they understood they had witnessed something historically unusual. That evening, when Albus sat alone in the upper astronomy tower, the presence of the pattern beyond fracture returned. The communication arrived gently. You are moving toward a role that is not primarily defined by power. Albus waited. You will become a stabilizing influence within a system that would otherwise become increasingly volatile. Do you mean the magical world? Albus asked. Yes. There was a long pause. Then the entity added something that carried unusual emotional weight for a non-human intelligence. People will come to trust you because you will not use power to dominate them. Albus said quietly. Is that my future? Probability projection suggests high likelihood. Another pause. Then the entity said, you will carry knowledge others cannot safely carry. You will choose restraint where others would choose expansion. And many will follow you because they will believe you will not betray their trust. Albus sat very still. He did not feel triumph, only responsibility. Far above him, the ancient castle of Hogwarts listened silently to the boy who had just performed a magical feat once associated with legendary historical wizards, and who had done so not by overwhelming force, but by understanding the structure of magic itself. Chapter 26. The Boy Whose Name Crossed the Academic World. The first indication that Albus Dumbledore was becoming known beyond Hogwarts' School of Witchcraft and Wizardry did not arrive in the form of public celebration. It arrived in letters. Professor Armando Dipet began receiving correspondence from external magical institutions requesting access to certain theoretical notes attributed to the young student. Some letters were written by senior magical researchers. Others were from independent arcane theorists who had heard rumors that a first-year student had demonstrated structural coherence casting that challenged accepted models of charm propagation. One letter, written in formal scholarly style, stated, there are claims that the Dumbledore student may be approaching conceptual magic traditionally reserved for advanced post-academic practitioners. Professor Dipet did not dismiss the letters, nor did he encourage them. He responded cautiously, protecting the boy's academic environment. Meanwhile, Albus himself remained largely unaware of the growing external attention. He spent most evenings reading theoretical manuscripts in the Hogwarts library, but he began noticing something unusual. Visitors to the castle occasionally asked to observe him, not students. Older witches and wizards who arrived under academic research permissions. They watched quietly when he performed demonstrations during supervised sessions. Some were members of recognized magical research societies. After one demonstration, an elderly scholar approached him. You are the boy studying structural magic theory, the man said. Yes, Albus replied politely. The scholar studied him for several seconds, then said, its communication carried unusual clarity. You are approaching a social threshold. Explain, Albus said. Your name is beginning to propagate outside your developmental environment. Albus waited. This will cause two simultaneous effects. First, increased intellectual interest from advanced magical communities. Second, increased expectation pressure from social and academic systems. Albus considered this carefully. Which effect is more important? The entity responded without hesitation. The second. Albus frowned slightly. Why? Because historical pattern data indicates that prodigious individuals are most vulnerable when society begins projecting identity expectations upon them. Albus said quietly, you believe I may be influenced by external perception. Yes. There was a pause. Then the entity added something more specific. Your future role is likely to involve acting as a mediator between magical systems that are becoming increasingly complex. Mediator. You will be trusted by multiple factions because you will not optimize for dominance. Albus thought about this carefully. Is this destiny? The entity answered in a way that was not prophetic, but analytical. It is a high-probability developmental outcome, given your current trajectory. Albus sat quietly for a long time after the communication ended. Outside the tower window, the winter sky stretched endlessly across the horizon. And far beneath the castle, the ancient intelligence of Hogwarts itself recorded the social propagation of the boy's reputation beyond its walls. The world was beginning to notice the child who listened to magic before attempting to speak to it. Chapter 27. The Test of Minds. The request arrived through Professor Armando Dipet. Several external scholars wished to conduct a controlled evaluation of Albus Dumbledore. The evaluation would be voluntary. It would take place inside the upper theoretical research hall of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Albus agreed. The hall was filled with visiting adult magical scholars from recognized academic societies. Some were elderly, some were middle-aged. All carried the quiet confidence of people accustomed to intellectual authority. Among them stood Elias Thorne, who had requested to participate in the demonstration. The lead scholar spoke first. We wish to observe your response to multi-layered magical complexity under external pressure. Albus nodded. What is the test? The scholar produced 3 enchanted objects. The first was a spatial distortion crystal designed to destabilize localized magical coherence. The second was a charm array that attempted to introduce structural noise into active spellcasting fields. The third was a kinetic resonance device intended to challenge environmental stabilization magic. Elias spoke quietly beside Albus. Let us attempt a joint theoretical demonstration, Elias said. Albus considered. Which system will you handle? The distortion crystal, Elias replied. Albus nodded. They began. Elias activated the spatial distortion crystal, constructing a containment lattice using precision analytical casting. Albus focused on the remaining 2 devices simultaneously. He raised his wand. Coherentia dualis. The charm array responded by aligning its noise vectors into a stable harmonic. The adult scholars were silent. After nearly 40 seconds, Professor Dippet asked, Are you maintaining all 3 systems simultaneously? Yes, Albus said. Without strain. Low cognitive load. Albus replied. Elias exhaled slowly. You are improving again, Elias said quietly. You are developing counterstructural response casting, Albus answered. The 2 boys exchanged a brief look of professional respect. Later that evening, the pattern beyond fracture returned. The entity spoke without preamble. You are approaching the role I predicted. Mediator between systems, Albus said. Yes. Then it added something more precise. You will eventually be asked to choose between power consolidation and systemic equilibrium. Albus asked, What is my destiny? The entity paused longer than usual. You will become a guardian of magical stability during periods when intelligence, magic, and human ambition begin to interact dangerously. Albus said quietly, Will people remember me? Yes. For what I achieved? For what you prevented? Albus sat silently. Outside the castle, winter wind moved across the high towers of Hogwarts. And far beyond the school, the wider magical world was beginning, slowly and carefully, to realize that a child prodigy was growing who might not be remembered as the strongest wizard in history, but as the one who made sure the world did not break. Chapter 28, The Thorn Resonance Spell. The announcement came during an advanced theory session inside Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Professor Armando Dippet entered the classroom carrying a small enchanted document sealed with academic certification runes. I have been informed, he said, that a new spell framework has been proposed by one of our students. Several students looked surprised. Then Professor Dippet continued. The creator is Elias Thorne. Elias stood. He was calm, but there was faint tension in his posture. This is an experimental structural casting technique, Elias said. He raised his wand. Resonaire Thorn Axis. The air inside the demonstration sphere shifted. The spell worked by generating a feedback-aligned magical oscillation field that amplified intended spell effects while suppressing chaotic dispersion. In simple terms, it allowed magical energy to reinforce itself along a controlled cognitive vector. The classroom was silent. Professor Dippet examined the effect carefully. This is not a combat spell, the headmaster said. No, Elias replied. It is a methodological spell. He looked briefly toward Albus Dumbledore. I was inspired by Dumbledore's structural magic philosophy. Albus nodded once. The spell was elegant. It was not designed to defeat Albus. It was designed to extend his ideas into a different mathematical implementation. Professor Dippet spoke quietly. Mr. Thorne, this may be one of the most academically significant student-developed spell frameworks recorded in Hogwarts history. Elias did not look pleased, but he did look satisfied. Later, Albus spoke to him privately. The entity spoke only one observation. The rivalry between you and Thorn is accelerating cognitive development in both participants. Albus asked, "Is that good?" The entity responded, "It is optimal for your species' intellectual evolution." Then added something that felt like a closing note. Your book, One Developmental Arc, is approaching completion. Albus did not respond immediately, because he understood what that implied. The path ahead would soon require choosing what kind of wizard he would become, not in power, but in purpose. Chapter 29, The Last Observation. Winter had settled deeply over Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Snow rested quietly upon the ancient stone towers, as if the castle itself preferred silence. That evening, Professor Armando Dippet requested the presence of Albus Dumbledore and Elias Thorne inside the oldest training chamber beneath the castle. The chamber was the same place where Albus had first encountered the hidden architecture of ancient magic. The air inside felt patient, waiting. The pattern beyond fracture spoke first. Its communication arrived as structured thought rather than sound. "This is the final observation phase of your developmental cycle." Albus asked quietly, "What does that mean?" "Your childhood cognitive exploration period is approaching completion. You will soon transition from student optimization learning to independent ethical magical agency." Elias spoke softly beside him. "So this is growing up." "Yes," Albus said. The entity continued, "I will reveal one final insight." The chamber runes illuminated slowly, drifting across the black stone like patient stars remembering the sky. Your destiny is not to rule magical society, nor to destroy threats to it. You are developing into a stabilizing intelligence embedded inside a volatile system. You will become someone people trust when they are uncertain. Silence followed. Then the entity added something unexpected. You will carry great magical power, but your greatest strength will be the decision not to use it unnecessarily. Albus felt a quiet acceptance settle inside his thoughts. Elias raised his wand. "One last demonstration?" Elias asked. Albus nodded. They stood opposite each other, not as enemies, not as competitors, as intellectual mirrors. Elias cast first. Resonator Thorn Axis. The feedback-aligned magical oscillation field formed slowly, glowing faintly inside the chamber. Then Albus lifted his wand. Lux Concordia. The spell was not destructive. It was not defensive. It was synthesis. The light inside the chamber aligned with the oscillation field, creating a stable harmonic resonance structure that remained suspended in space without strain. The magic did not fight. It agreed. Elias lowered his wand. "You are still ahead," he said. "Not ahead," Albus replied. "Different direction." They walked to the center of the chamber together. Above them, the ancient castle of Hogwarts reacted faintly. Not dramatically, but respectfully. Torches along the corridor outside dimmed slightly, as if acknowledging a transition. The castle was learning that the boy who spoke to magic was growing into the man who would listen to it. The pattern beyond fracture spoke one final time. "Your book one arc is complete," Albus said quietly. "Will I see you again?" "Yes. When your world requires structural equilibrium." Silence followed. Snow continued falling above the castle towers. And inside Albus Dumbledore's heart was not pride, nor fear, nor ambition alone, but the quiet understanding that his future would be defined not by how powerful he became, but by how carefully he chose to carry that power. Chapter 30, Book 1, Ember of Genius, Conclusion. The spring term would arrive soon. Albus stood alone on the Hogwarts terrace watching distant mountains soften beneath morning light. He was still young, still learning, still curious, but the world had begun to recognize something inside him. Not a conqueror, not a warrior, not a tyrant of magic, a guardian of understanding. Behind him, the castle of Hogwarts stood silent and ancient, holding the memory of a boy who had learned to speak to magic before attempting to command it. And far beyond the school, the future waited patiently for the wizard who would choose restraint over domination. Because the greatest power, Albus had learned, was not the ability to force the world to change, but the wisdom to decide when it should not. End of Book 1.